Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Well, we're continuing our analysis of Dan Barker's book, Godless, and today we come to chapter 10, where he discusses the Bible and morality. And this, of course, is kind of a key section here. I think that morality is one of the major problems with atheism. Um, and basically, what we're looking at, he lists a number of different objections that he has towards the Bible and morality. And one of them is that he basically wants to say that the Bible is a very, very poor guide toward human conduct and behavior. And he lists a number of objections. And objection number 2 says, the Bible nowhere states that every human being possessed an inherent right to be treated with respect and fairness. Humans don't matter as much as God does. Well, it's kind of a ridiculous account because they're going to argue that the exact opposite is true. That the Bible does, in fact, say that human beings ought to be treated with dignity and respect. And part of the problem with atheism is that it argues that we're just animals who evolved from lower forms of life. And so he's got it completely backwards there. But basically, as he goes through that section of the book, of the chapter, he basically, first of all, he tries to argue that according to Christianity, there are no human rights which God is obligated to respect. And there's a certain sense in which that's true, that God is our creator. He's infinite. He's all powerful. He has a right to do whatever he wants to do. And so therefore, you can't argue that somehow or other as human beings, we have an inherent right to dignity and respect which God himself is obligated to obey. Then he points to the doctrine of original sin, and he says the biblical view of human nature is negative. Humans don't deserve respect, they deserve damnation. And there is a element of truth to that in the sense that as God looks down on the human race, he does see a race of fallen and rebellious sinners, and that there's in a certain sense he's very, very justly angry of them. And there is a sense in which we do deserve damnation. And then he argues that religion encourages disrespect for people outside of one's religion. So the idea there is that if you hold to a certain kind of religion, then you argue that people that hold to an opposing type of religion are somehow inferior and don't deserve respect. And he says that religion has provoked religious wars, persecution of opposing religious views. And so he says that religion produces bad fruit. So there's like a half truth that's involved in all of that, but he overlooks a huge the other side of the coin. Basically, he's giving us kind of a straw man argument. He's giving us a very warped and distorted view of what the Bible actually teaches. So what does the Bible actually teach? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what it says in Psalm 8. It says, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth, who have displayed your splendor above the heavens. From the mouth of infants and nursing babes you have established strength because of your adversaries to make the enemy and the revengeful cease. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty. You make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas. O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. And so, first of all, on the one hand, he's drawing a contrast between God, the psalmist is drawing a contrast between God and man. So in verses 3 and 4, he says, When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have ordained, what is man that you take thought of him, or the son of man that you care for him? In other words, you take a look at the universe which God has created, and you can't help but be awestruck by the sheer majesty and grandeur of the whole thing, and the God that created it. And I know I live in a very rural area out here in north central Pennsylvania, so I'm surrounded by the beauty of nature, and you can go out at night on a clear night and see the distant stars and the moon, and you take a look at the mountains and the hills around, and you're struck by the fact that all of this had to have been, just the sheer majesty and beauty of everything, and then realize that whoever was that made all of this had to have been a very, very powerful, wise, and powerful person. And you just take a look at the complexity of living organisms and the ecosystems that we function in, and to realize all of this was designed and structured and put together by an intelligent supreme being who is vastly superior to ourselves. So there's a certain sense in which practically we are practically nothing in the sight of God, our Creator. But then the passage goes on to talk about man. You say, you have made him a little lower than God, and you crown him with glory and majesty, and you make him to rule over the works of your hands. You have put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the heavens, and the fish of the sea, whatever passes through the paths of the seas. So on the one hand, you take a look at the position that we occupy within the created universe, which God made. There's a sense in which we occupy a kind of a unique position, and that we have a kind of a dignity and a worth that you don't see among the animals. And basically, then so for example, and you compare us with animals, and again, I do not believe that we evolved from lower forms of life. If you have like a pet at home, even like a dog or a cat, and you look at your pet, you can see that there's a fundamental difference between us as human beings and the dog or the cat as animals. We have the ability to think and to reason and to use logic and to think out abstractly. We can communicate verbally. We can express our emotions in music. When was the last time you saw a monkey play a violin? There's something fundamentally different about us as human beings than just mere animals, and that gives us kind of a dignity within the nature that God has created. So then, when you go back to the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, and just a second here, go back to the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, and it says, just a second here, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female created he them. So on the one hand, it begins by saying that God made a conscious decision to create us in his image. And what that implies is that there's like a human essence that to which we conform. God conceived of the idea of a human being first, a Homo sapiens, and then he proceeded to make us according to that image. And because he created us in his image, that means that all of us as human beings share a common human essence. Okay, we share the image of God, and that means that every human being needs to be treated with dignity and respect. And I think we need to keep that in mind, because it is true that we have, in our fallen human nature, we have a tendency to look down on other peoples and so on. But the fact of the matter is that in the sight of Almighty God, a human being is a human being is a human being. And that human being deserves our dignity and respect, no matter what his race or nationality, no matter what language he speaks, no matter how much money he has in his bank account, whether he's an Olympic athlete or he's physically deformed. He's still a human being, created in the image of God, and we need to treat that human being with dignity and respect. And then the Bible goes on to say that human life is sacred. So, for example, right after the flood, God tells Noah, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. To go back to verse 5, surely I will require your lifeblood. From every beast I will require it, and from every man. From every man's brother I will require the life of a man. For whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed, for in the image of God he made man. In other words, there's a fundamental difference between taking the life of a human being and simply taking the life of an animal. Because as human beings we were made in the image of God. So to kill a human being basically is an act of sacrilege, and therefore That's a part of the dignity and respect that we have as human beings. We were creatures made in God's image, and therefore we need to be treated accordingly. So then you think in terms of like the basic moral precept, is that we're to love our neighbor. And Jesus demonstrated that in Luke 10 by the parable of the Good Samaritan, where he talks about how that, this person got robbed and, he's falls along the wayside and different people come by and they ignore him. Basically, to go back, that what happened was that, Jesus was approached by a rabbi who wanted to know, okay, what's the first and the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, well, the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind. And the second commandment, he said, like it, is to love your neighbor as yourself. Now think about that. We're not just required to just barely tolerate our neighbor. We're supposed to love our neighbor. We're supposed to care for him and his well-being. So then the rabbi asks this kind of typical, legalistic question. He says, okay, so who's my neighbor? What constitutes my neighbor? And so Jesus answers the question by telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. There was this person, he said, that got robbed along the way and was left to die, between, Jerusalem and Jericho. A couple of different people passed by. They saw the guy and they just walked on and left him alone. And then along came a Samaritan. And in the eyes of the Jews of Jesus' day, the Samaritans were kind of an inferior people. But the Samaritan comes along and he sees this person struggling along the world. And so he stops what he's doing. He tries to bandage him all up and to heal him. Then he takes him to an inn and to make sure that he's got a place to stay for the night. And he pays for the person's thing there. And so then Jesus says, well, who was the neighbor? And the Pharisee says, well, it was the Samaritan. And that is what God actually requires out of us in the way we ought to treat human beings. And then, of course, you take a look at the Ten Commandments, and the last 6 of the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. Basically, what they do is that they command a respect for the life, marriage, property, and reputation of others. And I should just kind of mention that, that a lot of there's a big debate going on right now about whether or not America is a Christian country and so on. And it could be argued that, strictly speaking, no, America is not a Christian country. Okay. And this is probably the reason why. We're required by God, first of all, to love the Lord our God with all our soul and all our might, which is not true of the majority of people. And then the majority of Americans or anyone else on the planet for that matter. And the second of all, we're to love our neighbor as ourselves, which means that we would not be have an economic system which is based on economic self-interest. We wind up, selling alcohol and tobacco products in the local convenience store because that's a way to make a corporate profit, even though, you're destroying people's health and their finances over the long haul. If you were a genuine Christian, would not sell anybody a pack of cigarettes, okay? Because that just violates the commandment that we're to love our neighbor and to do good for him. And then, of course, there's the question about what about justice? Okay, God does require justice. And what he does then is God does have a standard of justice that he requires of all human beings. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 23, in verses 6 through 9, it says, you shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just. You shall not oppress a stranger, since you yourselves know the feelings of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So in other words, God has laid, part of the moral law which God has laid down upon us is precisely that we ought to treat each other fairly and with respect. And there's a basic standard of justice we ought to have. And it's interesting that he especially says there in verse 9, you shall not oppress a stranger. And that would be basically like an immigrant, okay? That there are people, for example, who come to America from foreign countries, and sometimes they're fleeing from persecution or they're looking for economic opportunity. And while we want to make sure that that the laws are observed, at the same time we want to make it possible for a person to enter the country legally. Okay, we want to enforce the laws, We want to make it possible for a foreigner to enter the country legally, and so that he can find the opportunity that he looks at. Okay. And then we find that you go into Psalm 72, you get an interesting discussion of how the government is supposed to function or operate. You know, sometimes you get Christian nationalists who will argue that the Bible, the Constitution was founded on biblical principles, which isn't really true. Okay, no, most of the Constitution deals with how the federal government is supposed to be set up and operated. Nowhere in the Bible you're going to find anything that says that you have to have a presidential election every 4 years, or that you have to have 2 members of the U.S. Senate from every state. You won't find any of that. And there's a certain sense in which the Bible is kind of indifferent to the form of government that we have. It doesn't necessarily condone, let's say, you have to have a democracy or a republic or anything like that. And in fact, Romans 13 says we're to obey the magistrates, and that was written at a time when Nero was the Roman emperor. But what the Bible does concern about is how the government, whatever form the government takes, how the government functions and operate is a matter of great concern to God. And so in Psalm 72, we have a picture of what a righteous king actually looks like. And what it says in verses 1 through 4 is, "Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness, and your afflicted with justice. Let the mountains bring peace to the people, and the hills in righteousness. May he vindicate the afflicted of the people, save the children of the needy, and crush the oppressor." And then you go down to verses 12 through 14. It says, "For he will deliver the needy when he cries for help, the afflicted also, and him who has no helper. He will have compassion on the poor and the needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. He will rescue their life from oppression and violence, and their blood he will be precious in his sight." So I think it's significant there that the main responsibility of a human government is to look out for the poor and the needy. And I think it's because God recognizes, of course, that in any given human society, made up of the fallen sinners that it is, you're going to see people trying to take advantage of each other. You're going to see some people rising to positions of power and influence. You wind up with a class society. And then sometimes the people at the bottom of the economic and social class wind up suffering hardship. And part of the problem, part of the duty, a major part of the duty of a human government is to protect the people at the bottom of the social economic ladder and to make sure that the people are not being oppressed and taken advantage of unfairly. And that is something that we need to keep in mind when we think about how we want our government to function. So what it all boils down to is that Barker is just completely wrong. That what the Bible teaches is the exact opposite of what he's saying. The Bible says that every human being should be treated with dignity and with fairness and respect precisely because we were created by God in his image, and as humans, we were all subject to God's moral law. And ultimately, we're accountable to God, our Creator, and are going to have to give an account of him on the day of judgment. And one of the main things he's going to look at is, how do we treat our fellow human beings? You say, we're dignity. We have dignity and respect precisely because we were created by God in his image. So then you ask the question is, well, what exactly is the atheist alternative? And I know a lot of times you'll listen to these atheist YouTubers, and they like to complain about all the horrible things that they claim they see in the Bible. The misogyny and the genocide and the mass destruction of people and so on, of slavery. And then they turn right around and they shoot themselves in their foot, and they say, okay. So you ask the question, so what does atheism have to offer as an alternative? There are no moral absolutes. There are no objective truths, no objective morality. And they argue that we're just animals who evolved from lower forms of life. There is no supreme being, according to them, no lawgiver and judge. Evolution works through natural selection. It's all about the survival of the fittest. And as the poet put it, it's nature red in truth and claw. And as a result, governments can just do what they do. Sieg Heil. You know, and during the Third Reich, what makes what Hitler did wrong? Okay, there is no higher law to which you can appeal, according to atheism. I always go back to that key statement in the American Declaration of Independence that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among those rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Well, if you're an atheist, that statement is patently false. There is no Creator. So what makes us equal? Where do human rights come from? What makes human rights unalienable? You see, the only rights you have is whatever rights that your government, the Fuhrer, has basically endowed you with. And so if he wants to ship part of the population off to the concentration camp, hey, it's just the way human nature works, right? And ironically, Barker is basically co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And it's ironically, the Freedom from Religion Foundation traces its roots back to Ann Nicole Gaylor's campaign to legalize abortion, and which shows an utter disregard for the life of the unborn child. So, what the Freedom from Religion Foundation winds up basically arguing in the end is human beings don't have any right to dignity and respect because, at least not before they're born, because it's the right of it's the right of the mother to go ahead and take the child's life. There's nothing sacred about human life, and therefore it means nothing. And if the government can take away your life, it can take away anything, Um, and the biblical answer is we can find true human dignity and worth only in the Christian theistic worldview. It's basically that we live in a rationally ordered universe that was created by an intelligent supreme being. We're all ultimately accountable to God for the way we live and conduct ourselves and the way we treat each other. That's what gives us meaning and purpose in life. And our full humanity is realized in having a relationship with God, our Creator. It's basically when we think and reason, we interact with God, we think and reason and pray and worship Him, that we're reaching our full human dignity because those are things that animals can't do. And so the question is, let us be the creatures that God intended us to be. And so thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again.